opposing side. So he would always preempt something. He would always write a letter, said, this is what's going on. You might hear this and it's not true. Rule number 3, mold the message in such a way that the target audience understands it. Especially in the case of Pancho Villa, this required a complete revamping of the personality for public consumption. We talked about that yesterday.
Right.
We had to make, Pancho Villa nice. Rule number 4, control the message with surrogates who are beyond reproach. Sommerfeld used Army Chief of Staff Hugh Lennox Scott, Secretaries William Bryan, Lindley Garrison, Special Envoy William Byatt Hale, Minister Paul von Hintze, and dozens of carefully selected reporters and correspondents to articulate this message. Sommerfeld appeared in the forefront only in order to underline what was already said. He was very good at this, so he turned to propaganda for the German government. As it turned out, they did turn this around quite a bit. The Hale did a really good job. They had a daily brief for all the major editors on the German side of the news of the day, kind of like MSNBC against Fox News, And one of the editors said that one of his quotes was, the mail was Dernburged. So, Bernhard Dernburg being in charge of it, the mail was Dernburged so much that the postman could rarely stagger up the stairs. So there's so much junk mail coming every day from the German office. And they did interviews and so forth, turned it around a little bit, but then the Lusitania sinking came and it was over. Right? The whole propaganda effort died with the Lusitania sinking. There are also some funny advice things that they got. I found one that is written to Boyet, to Karl Boyet, the naval attaché, advice on how to do good propaganda. Brother Boyet, your press propaganda must be divided along sociological lines to reach the diverse elements of America. A socialist must be in charge of the propaganda to reach the socialist liberals with the argument that Germany is the cornerstone of progress, hence the alliance of the British and Yankee ultra-capitalists and the French bourgeoisie with the Cossacks. Second, a southerner must be shown in this leaflet. The Turks and blacks were being used to invade Germany to rape German womanhood. 3, the Pacific Coast leaflets must show the Judas of John Bull's alliance with the Yellows, etc. It is no use to reach the Anglophile church, hypocrite Yankees. Signed, Nietzsche. You find the funniest things in these archives, So, the propaganda, they tried very hard, but it didn't really help. And the British had, from the beginning, they had the upper hand of this. The reason why I wrote this book, the main reason is because there's a significant difference between the German strategy in 1914 and the German strategy in 1915. In 1914, they were trying to hurt the Entente powers. And they were not necessarily obeying all the laws of the United States. They falsified passports and so forth, but it did not injure the United States. It's a very big difference to what happened the year after in 1915. The German government started a sabotage campaign. They blew up American factories. They started the unrestricted submarine warfare. American sailors were killed and so forth. And so this significant difference is something that I think people need to understand. Actions have repercussions. If you support one side, then the other side will react to it. And if you really look at, the United States declared neutrality immediately as when the war started. But neutrality was only in a strictly legal sense neutrality because of the British blockade, the Germans could not import anything from the United States or Mexico or anywhere else. And so by allowing the Allies credit through J.P. Morgan and others, and allowing them to be the only ones that can ship munitions and supplies to Europe, they effectively became part of the combatant side. They became part of the supply line of the Entente. And as a result, Germany fought back. And I think this is really important when we talk today about politics in the Middle East. You bomb one country, don't think that they can somehow come back to you through terrorism or whatever other means they might have. This is a really important point. And the Americans were very shocked in 1915 when the sabotage campaign started. And they were shocked because they thought, hey, we declared neutrality, and how is it possible that the Germans are now suddenly, doing acts of war? And but to the German government, being part of the supply line was in itself an act of war. And I want to finish with a quote from Heinrich Albert that I put actually in the very front of the book, which is, I think, a very nice quote that encapsulates what the Germans were thinking and why they became violent after the end of 1914. This is a letter from Heinrich Albert to Prince Albert Wilhelm Heinrich von Preußen, so one of the cousins of Wilhelm II. Your Royal Highness surely is aware of how the situation in the United States has turned out. He wrote this in May 1915, so as the Lusitania was sunk. Instead of friendly sympathy, we encountered utmost enmity and a wholly unexpected hostility. We are practically at war with the United States. Anything that the United States is able to do to disadvantage us, she is doing. Deliveries of war materials of any kind to our enemies, granting large financial aid and credits, subjecting herself to English maritime regulations, which are mocking all principles of international law, and are aiming at a complete isolation of Germany. And by the way, I said the blockade was, in strict legal terms, illegal, because it did not only blockade Germany. I wish that we would not let the clamor of the American press let us be thrown off the right course, which is the only one to lead us to success, namely the ruthless exercise of all our might. I'm specifically thinking of submarines, flying airships, and airplanes. This is how the German government switched from trying to deal with America as a neutral country and battling the Entente interests here to really making the United States a focus. And we talked yesterday about how they tried to create a war between Mexico and the United States. The sabotage campaign, my book on that is incredibly telling. They sank hundreds of merchant ships. The unrestricted submarine warfare indiscriminately sank neutral and combatant ships. And but it is rooted in what happened in the beginning of the war. And I think that's, when you read history books, the Germans are always the real bad guys and so forth. And I'm not saying that there is no blame to go around, but there is a reason why policies shifted from basically cooperation and trying to work with the United States to outright hostility. And so this is my book. Thank you so much.
Before the United States joined the war, was the United States supplying England with a lot of materials?
Oh yeah, they were the number one supplier. So England didn't really have many reserves. It's an island, and so when the war started, they only had, especially for foodstuffs, they were very relying on American wheat and also raw materials to produce steel and so forth, and that all came from the United States. And so there's no question, they didn't have any munitions factories, for example. Those were all located in the United States, Remington and so forth. And so this is why the Germans were so angry, is that they had stockpiles, and so the American government at first said, well, neutrality, it would be fair if the Brits also would have munitions, to make it fair against the Germans. But the reality is that it was a one-sided thing. The Americans provided credit and supplied the British and the French with almost everything they needed. Hi.
And then the Lusitania sinking was just the excuse, or it was just the final?
Well,
they couldn't hide it anymore?
No, the Lusitania, so what happened with the Lusitania is a very special story. I mean, the Lusitania, it was the flagship of the British passenger lines. It's the largest ship. The Mauretania was part of the British Navy at that point, so it was a troop ship. And the Lusitania was going every 4 weeks back and forth to New York. And it had a cruising speed of 35 knots. I mean, this is a fast ship. And so, if you look at a submarine, when it's underwater, 9 knots is the maximum speed. You know, so the British were basically saying, what are you going to do with your submarines? You know, you'll never catch them. And so they were going back and forth, and they were literally taunting the Germans, even in the newspapers. The publicity agent of the White Star Line, he would put up stuff like, or it wasn't White Star, it was the other line. He would put up articles saying, you know, that it is scientifically impossible for a submarine to sink this ship. That's how they were getting more and more passengers, including Americans. And so the Germans tried very hard to, you know, make a point here. And so already in February on the route to England, they had 2 submarines waiting, but it was foggy and they couldn't get the Lusitania. They never saw her. And but I looked at their logs of the submarine captains, and so they were sent out to specifically sink the Lusitania. Who was the guy that Wilson sent to Europe? Colonel, I forgot his name, but anyway, so he's an emissary of Wilson. He goes to Europe on the Lusitania. When they get close to the British Isles, the Lusitania raises the American flag, a false flag. This is in international law. That's really bad. Not that anybody wouldn't know what the Lusitania looks like with 4 funnels and everything. And this guy actually witnessed, you know, and told Wilson. He said, you know, they're using false flags. This is one thing the Germans complained about. And so anyway, so they wanted to get the Lusitania, and so in May 15th, they got her. And you know, there's a lot of luck involved. If you read how these submarines actually operated, it was very lucky to actually come across a big ship like that. And he sent 1 torpedo. The torpedo struck in the forward third of the ship, and the ship literally blew up. It was a huge explosion. And because it was traveling at significant speed, it actually literally drove into the ground. It was only afloat for 20 minutes with 1,300 people on board. Among others, 129 Americans that died. And they were literally in front of the coast of Ireland. They could see the land, but it was nothing they could do. And so then the propaganda war started. You know, why did she sink so fast? There must have been munitions on board. You can still read this in history books, that there were munitions. There were no munitions on board. There were some small arms munitions that had nothing to do with that explosion. There were some empty shells. So from a strictly legal sense, yes, that made her a contraband carrier. But in terms of why she sank so fast, the guy that found the Titanic, he finally lifted the secret. Do you remember that movie that he made when he found the Titanic with these robots and stuff? He went and dived on the Lusitania, and what they found was that one of the holds for coal was empty, and the torpedo struck into this empty compartment, and the coal dust actually ignited and blew up the ship. Wow. That's exactly what happened. So there was nothing, no conspiracy whatsoever, no bombs on board or anything like that. It was a lucky hit. And the Germans were actually pretty shocked. So the Walter Schwieger, who was the captain of the U-boat that sank it, you know, he turned away. They could not take on any passengers, of course. But I read, Franz Rintelen, for example, wrote something where he said, you know, we had no idea this ship would sink this fast. So they kind of thought they're going to put a torpedo into her, and then they would have to evacuate, and then she wouldn't run back and forth to New York. They had no idea this thing would go down in 20 minutes and kill everybody. So, you know, but this happens when you play with fire, I guess, you know. You should not torpedo a passenger liner, you know. But that was a specific thing, and it was an act of terrorism. And this is, again, you know, when you look at that time, terrorism didn't play a role. You know, the word terrorism didn't really exist. But if you really think about it, they only had a handful of submarines. I think 12 altogether, and only 5 or 6 of them were diesel-powered that could even go far. And they were trying to blockade England with you know, a handful U-boats. That would never work. And so a lot of books that you read say, oh, you know, the Germans were crazy. They would have never been able to do a blockade. That was all illegal. And, you know, the fact was that they used these submarines for terrorism. What actually happened was sinking a ship like that. What did that do? First of all, the passengers were frightened. So nobody wanted to go on the ships. You know, so the British, you know, it would hurt the British shipping. The second thing is insurance premiums went through the roof. You know, that was unbelievable. The third thing, and we have this today with airlines. You know, the passenger ships at the time were the airlines of today. And what do we have today? We have to go through metal detectors and stuff like that. When the Lusitania, not the Lusitania, when the other ships, the Sussex and the Rabbit or whatever, the other ships that came calling on the U.S. harbors, they had to look at every suitcase. It took a week to load these ships. It was a mess. I read descriptions of the New York harbor where the passenger liners were staying, you know, a bunch of Scandinavian liners and so forth. It was a mess. They literally interrupted the transatlantic flow of people. So it was terrorism. It was pure and simple terrorism, and that's why they did it. And they could do it with only a handful of boats. You only have to hit one boat here, one boat there. Not a big deal, you know.
Well, that's the purpose of terrorism.
Exactly.
To minimize the force and cause the most damage.
Exactly. And so, you know, the argument to say that because Germany didn't have enough submarines, they could never have blockaded England. Well, that wasn't the point. The point is that they got insurance rates to go crazy, that you know, they got cargo stopped. They made it, you know, very hard for passengers to travel to Europe. I mean, they were very successful with these few boats, if you really think about it. You know.
Well, they must have lain in wait for the Lusitania. They must have known, of course, that
Oh,
it
yeah.
would go a certain route.
Well,
And,
it's kind of funny you say that because, you know, I read all these conspiracy theories how the Germans must have, you know, had spies everywhere to figure out where these boats were going. The routes were published.
yeah.
You can read them in the New York Times. It would tell you exactly when the ship would leave and where it would go and where it would call in the harbor, what day it would arrive. It was in the New York Times. So there's no conspiracy there whatsoever. You don't need an agent, you just need somebody to read the paper. Yeah, so they knew exactly when these ships left and they knew where they were going, and you're exactly right. They were timing it. You know, Schwieger actually made a U-turn. He sank some commercial ship, and then he made a U-turn. He was literally waiting for the Lusitania to come by. And later on, he said he didn't know it was the Lusitania. That's of course ridiculous. The only four chimney boat that went by there. You know, it's the largest passenger liner that was there. So yeah.
Now,
Thank you so much.
Hapag-Lloyd, is that connected somehow with Lloyd's of London?
No. This is so there were basically two large corporations. One was Hapag, which is, we were playing this in the car, right? The Hamburg Amerikanische Paketfahrtgesellschaft. So it was a Hamburg America line. There was a big Hamburg America line building actually in New York on Broadway, where Darren Burke worked. Was the Hamburg America line. And then there was a second one that was based in Hamburg, and in Bremen it was the North German Lloyd, and that was the company North German Lloyd. Today it's Hapag-Lloyd. They merged, you know, it's one company now. But at that time the North German Lloyd was a separate company, and they were competing, and they built ever bigger passenger ships. So the founder of Hapag, Albert Berlin, actually invented pleasure cruises. So he is the, you know, when you look at cruise ships today, he's the first one that invented pleasure cruises. And they built ever larger ships. The largest ship ever built was the Vaterland, was the SS Vaterland. That was a Hapag ship. It was twice as long as the Titanic.
Oh my.
Wow.
And it was a super luxury
That's the
cruiser.
Titanic. Oh.
Yeah, and it was a super luxury cruiser. It only did like 4 tours, and then the war broke out, and it was berthed in New York. And then, of course, after the war, the Germans lost all their ships, and so she became the Leviathan. It was an American ship that was driving in the 20s under the name Leviathan. Yeah, largest passenger ship ever built, other than what they're building today. I mean, what they build today is way beyond.
And stores,
Yeah, crazy.
Just a question about the U-boats, not in the First World, on the Second World War. In your opinion, and based on your research, when Mexico joined the war, is because they claimed that the German U-boats were in Tamaulipas and they sank the Faja de Oro and the Potrero Villano and all this. But there's all these people that say, no, it's not true, it's not possible. The Germans didn't have that many U-boats and they were not going to go that far away from Germany. Therefore, it was probably American U-boats. What do you think, in your opinion, happened?
Well, again, I mean, it's very interesting because the submarine strategy in World War I and World War II are very similar. A lot of the lessons that they learned in World War I, they were using in World War II. Also the other side. taking ships in convoys. That was something that they did after the submarines were sinking so many single ships. But in World War I, only the diesel-powered ships could make it across the Atlantic. And it's absolutely correct, in World War I there was really no reason to come to the US. They were basically going around England, and they were trying to cut off England. But, which is a really funny story, they did want to show the Americans that they could come to America. So in 1915, the Germans sent one submarine from Germany, and it landed, I think in Rhode Island, suddenly appeared in the harbor, in New London it was, I think, appeared in the harbor, surfaced, and the captain, saluted and had the harbor master call the Navy, the American Navy, and said, I invite anybody who wants to see my ship to come on board. And so literally busloads of Pentagon people came, from the War Department, came to check out this submarine. It was the most modern submarine Germany could build. And this Captain Koenig was his name, very flamboyant guy. He showed them everything, and he said, we can come to America anytime we want to. And then he said, okay, now I have to go again. And he went out of the harbor, went underwater, sank 5 British ships that were waiting for him outside the harbor, sank them all. The poor Americans, the Coast Guard, they were going like there were ships sinking literally all around them with people swimming in the water, and this guy went back to Germany. So that's the only time in World War I that they actually took a submarine to the United States. And they also had a commercial submarine, but that was a war submarine. So in World War II, I'm pretty sure that they were patrolling the US coast. Whether they patrolled Mexico, I wouldn't know why. Maybe because of the Panama Canal, but I don't think they, we have the Intracoastal Waterway. I don't know if you know about this, but all along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, still today, I have a boat. I love the Intracoastal Waterway. You don't have to go out on the ocean. You can go all along the coast without ever going on the ocean. That was built by the Corps of Engineers so that commercial traffic could go up and down the coast without being subject to sinking from German submarines. So they were all over. They also were in front of New Orleans, for example, and so forth. So were there submarines in front of Mexico? I would think once in a while, but was it strategically important? I don't know. I don't think so. Oil? Maybe because of the oil, yeah. But by then, they could do it. They had improved the technology. Do you know who invented the submarine?
I thought it was the American.
American, yeah, exactly.
During
Mr.
the
Holland.
Civil War, isn't it?
Well, in the Civil War, they built one. There's only one that is known of in Charleston Harbor. They found it a few years ago. It had they basically had a stick with an explosive a bomb in front of it, and they were pedaling and ramming into a boat. And so the problem was they never thought about what happens when this thing actually blows up and you have to pedal backwards to get back out of it. So they found this thing 100 years later in the harbor, They never made it out alive. But it was this engineer in New Jersey, Holland was his name, who invented the submarine. The idea of being able to use your compress air and using ballast to move the submarine up and down. That he invented that.
Was that from Jules Verne's theories, like the Jules Verne's novels, the submarine?
I don't know if he might have used Holland's technology.
That was the beginning. I don't know if I'm wrong. Maybe.
No, you're right. I mean, Jules Verne wrote about how a submarine could go under the ice, for example, right? And Holland, he was the only one that had figured out how to do this. That you could actually stay underwater as long as you want through compressed air. And so it's very possible, these writers, many of these writers did their research with scientific magazines and so forth, and, he could have read that. The Germans tried to buy a patent, by the way,
Is that right?
yeah, so that Holland couldn't sell to anybody else, but he wouldn't do it.
Now, using diesel on a submarine, it was very, very, very unpleasant
Oh
experience.
my God, you
To be
cannot
inside a
imagine.
U-boat.
You cannot imagine. I mean, I've only been on World War II submarines, that's already bad enough. World War I submarines must have been torture for the people living on these things. First of all, they were very narrow. This, there were, pipes and vents and grease and, the bad smell, bad air in this tiny thing, and they wouldn't stay underwater very long if they could help it. Most of the time they stayed afloat and charged their batteries, went up top, but sometimes when they were pursued by somebody, they had to lay. Usually they didn't go far underwater. They would just basically go to the bottom and stay there. And sometimes they had to wait for like 2 days before whoever is above gave up. And I wouldn't want to be on that boat. And by the way, not many of the submariners made it back alive. Many of these ships sank. They were very vulnerable. The British actually used cables, so they would string underwater cables that you couldn't detect with a submarine. They would run into the cables and it would punch a hole in the submarine. These cables were, by the way, produced by the Roebling plant in New Jersey. And the Roebling plant was blown up twice. And it was one of the German sabotage targets because they made these wires that were sent to Britain and so forth.
But there also were the discharge tanks like barrel that will go down and it will do by compression water.
That's right. I mean, but that was more in the Second World War. Yeah.
Yes.
In the First World War, it was very hard to actually do something about a submarine. The number one thing that they tried to do is ram it.
Mhm.
Ram it. You would basically, if you see a submarine, you would, the torpedoes went either out they always went out the front.
Mhm.
And so if you saw a submarine somewhere, you would try to get behind it and then they're slow, they're only 9 knots, and they would just run right over them.
Mm.
And so many of the submarines were actually sunk that way. Yeah. Very vulnerable. This was also, one of the big disputes about the submarine war, because according to the Declaration of London, if you wanted to capture a ship, you had to basically shoot in front of the ship, make the ship stop, and if the ship stops, then you can enter it, and you get their papers, and if you find contraband, you can take it as a prize, and even sink it. Yeah. But a submarine, of course, couldn't do that. The moment the submarine surfaced, it was totally vulnerable. You could shoot it with a hunting rifle.
Mm-hmm.
It just had a thin layer of metal. So that was one of the big disputes about how would submarines actually deal in a modern war, and it was a big dispute. And still today, lawyers are arguing about it. What is international law? It's a new technology.
They can
But it
shoot
was very
missiles.
difficult.
Now they can shoot missiles.
Yeah, now it's a whole different ballgame, and they're huge. I spent a lot of time in Charleston. They have the submarine station in Charleston. There are submarines that are 300, 400 feet long.
Wow.
Huge. And they can stay underwater for months, undetected. Underwater for many months, yeah.
The nuclear ones.
Mhm. Yeah, they're nuclear powered.
Mhm.
And, our strike force is actually, not even the Navy knows where they are most time.
Technology changed rapidly. So the Zimmerman telegram was not the reason why the United States went to war.
No. I mean, why would the United States go to war? I mean, there's two main reasons. One is the United States had extended credit to the Entente since 1914.
Mhm.
In today's money, trillions of dollars. And of course, you didn't want these guys to lose. Right? So, I mean, there was a vested interest to make sure that they win. And if you think World War I was so easy, it was actually very close at the end. The Russian front, basically, the Russians made peace after the Russian Revolution. The Germans took all their troops to the Western Front, and for a while, it was not sure who's going to win. And so the Americans, they actually carried the day. If the American troops, fresh troops, wouldn't have been there, it might have been looking different. The second thing is, of course, if your national security is challenged. Was it an issue of national security? That's one of the things you read in both my books about World War I. Of course, national security was in question. The Germans were blowing up factories, ships. This was the national security of the United States. The Zimmerman telegram was part of that because also Germany was making trouble for America on its border. It's a national security issue. But I think Wilson he had to win the election in 1916, And he knew already in 1916 that they have to go to war. He won the election with a slogan, he kept us out of war, right? That was his election
That's right.
campaign slogan. He kept us out of war. But the reality was, by 1916, it was very clear that the Americans probably would have to join. It was also clear to the Germans, and I told you yesterday, the Zimmermann telegram, Mr. Zimmermann himself admitted, I wrote